Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon to our witnesses. It's good to have you here. I'd like to thank you for being here today to talk about the several Air Force intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance programs. As the chairman has pointed out, ensuring that the Air Force preserves and expands the support it provides to the joint force in this mission area has been an ongoing concern for the subcommittee for many years. The United States has the world's largest and most advanced airborne reconnaissance fleet. The question for Congress is, in my view, how do we keep it that way and make it even better? This capability does not, of course, come cheap. Continued investment in the platforms, sensors, data networks, and, importantly, the people across the ISR community is required. It is not surprising, then, that the cost of this enterprise creates tension inside the Air Force's budget. And while some trade-offs with other important Air Force missions are appropriate, all too often this mission area appears to be viewed as a bill payer for other Air Force needs. In addition, there is some important recent history with the Congress in this area. Since I joined this committee, the Air Force has proposed retiring the U-2 and Global Hawk fleets. In both cases, Congress blocked these plans based primarily on concerns about overall ISR capacity and constant shortfalls in this mission area. In the end, in both cases, Congress concluded that the Air Force's request to retire these platforms was the result of a narrow, short-term, purely funding-driven view that failed to account for an ever-growing demand for ISR on behalf of our combatant commanders around the world. That is important context for today's hearing. The fiscal year 2019 request for Air Force programs in this area is overall quite well funded. Continued investments in the U-2, RQ-4 Global Hawk, RQ-9 Reaper, RC-135 reconnaissance aircraft, and E-3 Sentry fleets look healthy compared to recent requests. There is also funding for the ground-based side of the ISR enterprise. There is, however, one important exception to this overall positive trend, the proposed termination of the JSTARS replacement program. As we'll hear more about today, the Air Force plans to cancel the JSTARS replacement program in order to develop a decentralized network capability that integrates sensors across many platforms. This decision deserves close consideration for several reasons. First, while the Air Force notes its decision is based on new threats, those very same threats were considered in 2011 when the DoD conducted an analysis of alternatives that led to the JSTARS replacement program. Second, those same threats cited by the Air Force are a danger to any non-stealth aircraft in the early stages of a conflict. Yet the Air Force is not proposing mass retirements of fourth-generation fighters or even other reconnaissance aircraft based on commercial aircraft, such as the E-3 AWACS KC-46 tanker, RC-135 rivet joint, or compass call. Third, the Air Force appears to be walking away from the joint in JSTARS. The origin of the original E-8 JSTARS fleet was a desire to integrate with U.S. Army sensors and weapons to attack targets behind enemy lines. The Air Force's proposal to terminate this program sends a message to the U.S. Army that the Air Force is no longer prioritizing this mission. Fourth, the Air Force appears to have discounted the risks involved with their alternative network-based plan, specifically the time risk, the cost risk, and potential vulnerability of such a network to jamming or cyber attack. Finally, the Air Force is once again proposing to shrink the size of the airborne ISR fleet at the same time that demands continue to rise. This committee has rejected the Air Force's last two proposals to do the very same thing. I look forward to today's hearing and yield back. Thank you. I'd like to just visit the process that brought us to this place where, with this sort of abrupt change of direction. So as we know, 70 years ago, the Air Force conducted the analysis of alternatives to determine what capabilities a JSTARS replacement would need and what kinds of threats the aircraft would likely encounter. And since that time, the Air Force has invested hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars and countless staff hours from some of our brightest minds to build a next-generation JSTARS capability, an effort built around conclusions that were drawn in 2011. Now those conclusions have been re-examined, and Congress is being asked to cut our losses and pursue a different and technologically challenged alternative, with time risks, cost risks, and unknown cyber vulnerabilities. So my point is this: there has to be a process in place to make sure that taxpayer dollars are being spent as wisely and efficiently as possible, and that we in Congress can trust that process. So General Harris, my question is twofold. Did the Air Force simply get the 2011 AOA wrong? And if so, how can we go about correcting the AOA process in the future to make sure we are spending taxpayer dollars on the capabilities we need, and that it's a process that brings, when it brings forth its decisions, we in Congress can trust was done in a forward-looking way?
Yes, ma'am, that's a great question. I wouldn't say in 2011 we got the analysis of alternative studies wrong. We just looked at and underestimate the pace of change and the threats that come up. We talked through that AOA, multiple threats that exist today that were forecast to be here in 2024 and 2028. So that threat has accelerated quickly. And I think the committee here will recognize why that's happened based on some of the pictures we've shown in our past engagements from that. When it comes to us in the process, we do intend to move our acquisition process and our requirements process faster than what we've been doing, which will allow us to be able to get ahead of the technology piece. So the money that we invested in the JSTARS recap effort, those radars, the technologies we're pulling out of that, we think will still benefit us in increment 2 and increment 3 as we move forward. So it was not money wasted.
So what you're suggesting is that you didn't anticipate the pace of change or the pace of evolution among our near peers. And my question would be, there have to be people out there who could have been brought into this process who could have better assisted the Air Force in thinking further out, or a better understanding that, who are in a world in which change comes much more quickly, who knew this had the potential to move rather quickly, more quickly than you were thinking about. And so how in the future do you be sure you're casting a wide net to get that kind of thinking at the table?
Okay, so we do have a new senior acquisition leader in our department who leans forward in that direction, and as we heard testimony from him yesterday in a different committee, he is committed to that process. So I think you'll see those changes coming up, and it's a change in the way we've done business in the past. We certainly don't intend to start down one direction and have abrupt changes, but we have a national defense strategy that's changed. In 2011, we weren't talking about peer threats. We didn't have a strategy that said you need to focus on the high end of the combat. We were focused on winning today's fight in a coin type of an environment where this airplane was well developed and deserved. So I would say that while we may not be keeping with the pace of change, we're trying to change that rather than continue to invest money in the old way of doing things, that 15 years from now we'll have the same capability in a JSTARS recap aircraft that we have today, but it'll only work in a small portion of the globe rather than our increment 3 that we're trying to get at to span the globe.
Question for you, General Irabardi. The original reason for the JSTARS aircraft was to enable Air Force and Army coordination for attacking targets deep behind enemy lines. That mission still seems very relevant in the context of possible conflicts with North Korea and Russia, where the U.S. Army and our allies will likely face large enemy ground forces. The Air Force's original AOA, certified by the Joint Staff, determined that Joint Battle Command with the U.S. Army on board the aircraft itself was still an important requirement. Is that no longer the case? And how will the Air Force integrate the ability to attack well behind enemy lines with the Army under the proposed JSTARS alternative?
Thank you, ma'am. The Army certainly should expect the delivery of the capabilities required for it to operate in a wartime environment against a near peer or a peer competitor in a high intensity action. That we expect will be delivered by the Air Force, by the Joint Force, the collection of assets that are available to provide commanders what they require. So the JSTARS, as it was envisioned to provide those capabilities in a contested environment, as we've described, that has changed, and indeed we can say the intent would be to be able to deliver under ABMS an even greater level of support to warfighting commanders in contested environments than they might otherwise receive as we watch the threat evolve in places that, like as you've described.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.